Charles leaned back in his leather chair, sipping an expensive glass of wine. His mansion stood tall, a symbol of wealth and success. The grand marble floors, golden chandeliers, and massive glass windows showcased everything he had achieved. He loved the feeling of power that came with money. Outside his mansion, luxury cars lined the driveway. A team of workers moved around, keeping the property spotless. He paid them well, but never bothered to learn their names. To Charles, money was everything. It separated the powerful from the weak. Every morning, Charles stepped out onto his balcony, enjoying the view of the city below. He loved the way people looked up at him with admiration or envy. He had worked hard for his success, and he wanted the world to see it. One thing, however, always ruined his perfect view. Across the street, near the sidewalk, sat a homeless man. He wasn't dirty or desperate looking, just calm. Too calm for someone who had nothing. The man, dressed in worn-out clothes, sat with his back against the fence, watching the world go by. He never begged. He never looked miserable. He just sat there, as if he belonged. Charles found it irritating. Why would someone who had nothing look so at peace? It made no sense to him. He assumed the man had failed in life, that he had made bad choices and ended up on the streets. As he finished his drink, Charles shook his head. He had no time to think about people like that. Life was about winning, and he had already won. But he had no idea how quickly everything was about to change. Daniel sat in his usual spot near the mansion's fence, watching the world move around him. He wasn't in a rush. He never was. Life to him was not about running, but about observing, understanding. He wore an old but clean jacket, slightly torn at the edges. His jeans were faded, and his shoes had seen better days, but he didn't seem to mind. His hair was neatly combed, and his face, though tanned from the sun, carried a peaceful expression. People passed by him every day. Some glanced at him, some ignored him, and others looked down as if ashamed to acknowledge his presence. He never asked for money. He never held a sign. Yet, he never looked hungry or lost. Daniel had been sitting in the same spot for weeks, always at the same time. In the morning, he would watch the city wake up. In the evening, he would watch it slow down. It was a routine he enjoyed. Despite his simple appearance, there was something unusual about him. He didn't carry bags filled with junk. He didn't mutter to himself like other homeless people. He didn't look broken. Some workers from the mansion had started to notice him. One of them, an older gardener, once asked, "Why do you sit here every day?" Daniel had simply smiled. "I like the view," he said. The gardener had chuckled and walked away, but the answer stuck with him. Daniel's presence was a mystery to most. But he wasn't there by accident. He had a reason. And soon, that reason would become clear. One morning, Charles stepped out onto his front porch, stretching as he breathed in the crisp air. His expensive silk robe flowed as he walked toward his luxury car, parked in the long driveway. As usual, he spotted the homeless man sitting near the fence. Charles frowned. It was becoming a daily sight, and he didn't like it. The man had no business being there. He walked toward the fence, hands in his pockets. His polished shoes tapped against the pavement, a sharp contrast to the quiet presence of the man sitting on the ground. "Hey," Charles called out. "You sit here every day? What's your deal?" Daniel looked up, his expression calm. "I just like the view." Charles scoffed. "The view?" He laughed, shaking his head. "You mean my mansion?" Daniel nodded. "It's a beautiful house." Charles smirked. "Yeah, I know, but let's be honest, you'll never have a place like this." He folded his arms. "Tell me something. What happened to you? Bad choices? Bad luck?" Daniel didn't seem offended. "Depends on how you look at it." Charles chuckled. "Let me guess, you used to have a great job, maybe even a family, but you lost it all. And now you're here, sitting on the ground, watching other people live the life you wish you had." Daniel tilted his head slightly, thinking, "Maybe. Or maybe I just don't see life the same way you do." Charles laughed louder this time. "You're something else." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a few bills, tossing them onto the pavement. "Here, buy yourself a meal, maybe a new jacket." Daniel looked at the money but didn't move. "I don't need it." Charles raised an eyebrow. "Everyone needs money." Daniel smiled slightly. "Not everyone." Charles rolled his eyes. "Suit yourself." He turned around and walked away, shaking his head. As he stepped back into his house, he muttered under his breath, "What a fool." But what Charles didn't know was that in just a few days his entire world would turn upside down. A few days later, Charles sat in his grand office, scrolling through financial reports. His mood was sour. Something wasn't adding up. The numbers weren't looking good. He grabbed his phone and called his financial advisor. "Explain this to me," he demanded. "Why am I seeing losses?" The voice on the other end hesitated. "Charles, there's a problem." Charles clenched his jaw. "What kind of problem?" "Your investments, they've crashed." Charles blinked. "What do you mean crashed?" "Bad stock choices, market shifts, lawsuits, it all hit at once. You've lost almost everything." His stomach dropped. "That's not possible. I have millions." "Not anymore." Charles's grip tightened around his phone. "Fix it." The advisor sighed. "It's too late, you're in debt. The bank is freezing your accounts, and Charles, they're repossessing your mansion." The words hit him like a punch to the chest. He shot up from his chair, knocking over his glass of whiskey. "No. This is my house, my life. I'm sorry, you have to sell everything." Charles hung up, breathing heavily. His heart pounded as he looked around his mansion. The golden decor, the priceless paintings, the furniture worth more than most people's salaries. Gone. Over the next few days, reality sank in. His expensive cars were taken, his staff left, his name was dragged through the news. Friends stopped answering his calls. One by one, everything disappeared. Soon, he was standing in an empty mansion, staring at the walls that once made him feel powerful. A for sale sign was placed outside. Charles, once the man who mocked those without money, was now on the edge of losing everything. And the worst part? He had no idea who would buy his mansion next. Charles stood outside his mansion, staring at the for sale sign with a blank expression. Just a few weeks ago, this place had been a symbol of his power. Now it was just another asset being sold off to pay his debts. The sale had happened fast. The buyer had made an offer immediately, paying in full without negotiation. Charles didn't even get the chance to fight for his home. Now he was about to meet the person who would take everything he once owned. A black car pulled up in front of the mansion. The driver stepped out, walked around to the passenger side, and opened the door. Charles waited, arms crossed, trying to maintain whatever pride he had left. Then he saw the buyer step out. His eyes widened, his chest tightened. It was Daniel, the homeless man. The same man who had been sitting near his fence watching the world go by. Charles took a step forward, his voice caught between shock and anger. "You," Daniel gave a small smile. "Hello, Charles." Charles blinked, struggling to process what he was seeing. This doesn't make sense. You were..." He stopped himself. Daniel tilted his head slightly. "Sitting on the ground, watching your house?" Charles's mind raced. "How? Where did you get the money?" Daniel didn't answer right away. He simply walked past Charles, up the steps and toward the mansion doors. He ran a hand along the frame as if he had been here before. "I made an offer the moment it went on sale," Daniel said finally. "And now it's mine." Charles's mouth went dry. He had spent years believing money made him superior. Yet the man he had laughed at was now the owner of everything he had lost. For the first time in his life, Charles felt truly powerless. And he had no idea what was coming next. Charles still couldn't believe what was happening. The homeless man, the same man he had mocked, now owned his mansion, his hands curled into fists. "Who are you?" he demanded. Daniel turned to face him, calm as ever. "Just a man who sees the world differently." "That doesn't answer my question," Charles snapped. "You sat out there for weeks, you acted like you had nothing. And now suddenly, you can afford this mansion?" Daniel sighed and looked up at the house. "I used to live in a place like this once. I had more money than I knew what to do with." Charles frowned. "So what happened?" "I gave it up." Charles let out a short, bitter laugh. "No one gives up wealth." Daniel met his gaze. "I did." Silence stretched between them. "I was a businessman just like you," Daniel continued. "I had everything, cars, power, success, but one day I realized none of it mattered. Money doesn't change the way people see you. Not really. It only changes the way they treat you." Charles narrowed his eyes. "So, what? You decided to throw it all away?" Daniel shook his head. "No, I decided to see life from a different perspective. I put my money in hidden investments and left my old life behind." Charles felt his stomach twist. "Why?" Daniel's eyes softened. "Because I wanted to understand people. Without wealth, without power, without status, I wanted to see how the world treats those who have nothing. Charles felt a lump in his throat. Daniel glanced at the mansion again. I sat outside this house because I was curious about you. I wanted to see who you were without the money. Charles swallowed hard. He had spent weeks believing he was better than Daniel. He had laughed at him, thrown money at him, treated him like he was invisible. But now, the truth was clear. Daniel had never been beneath him. And Charles had never truly been above anyone. Charles stood frozen, his mind racing. Everything he believed about power, success, and status was crumbling before him. Daniel walked toward the mansion doors, then turned back to face him. You once told me I would never afford a place like this, he said calmly. Now, it's mine. Charles swallowed hard. What are you going to do with it? His voice was quieter now, almost unsure. Daniel studied him for a moment. Then, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a single key. Here, he said, holding it out. Charles frowned. What's this? The key to the guest house in the back, Daniel said. It's small, simple, nothing like what you're used to. Charles hesitated. His pride screamed at him to refuse, but deep down, he knew he had no other options. He had lost everything. Slowly, he reached out and took the key. His fingers trembled slightly. Daniel nodded. Stay as long as you need, but this time, try seeing the world differently. Charles didn't respond. He couldn't. For the first time in his life, he had no witty comeback, no sharp remark. He just stood there, watching Daniel walk into the mansion that had once been his. As the doors closed behind him, Charles let out a slow breath. Everything had changed. And for the first time ever, he wasn't sure what would come next.